Wrote in his great novel, A Tale of Two Cities, the beginning line is, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." That can be said really for almost any century of human existence or any era. There are certain times, though, however, that are landmarks. They are the large markers in the channel that kind of know where you are. There's a great book called A Distant Mirror, if you ever heard of it. It's written by a woman named Barbara Tushman, and she proposes that the 14th century was one of those times, 1300s. The other one, she says, were vital, was the 20th century, believe it or not, because the world as we knew it changed immeasurably in many ways in the 20th. So we get these time periods all through Western civilization that seem to kind of stand out and cause other things. History is a process, in other words. It's not a series of isolated events. And one of the best TV programs I ever saw was done many years ago by the British, of course, in history. But it was called Connections. And they would take a process like the computer, and they would take you back to where people used punch cards, and they used them a long time, and trace the connections with people and processes that brought us to the modern computer. It's a great series. It's worth finding. The era we're talking about stands out, the 16th century, because of what happened in church history or in Christianity. But it was the result of a lot of other things that were going on long before this ever occurred. In other words, its time, its events, its processes, most of which are connected one way or the other. So it's very difficult to understand how all of this happened without having some idea of what was going on before, leading up to the events of 1517 and subsequently. If we want to start this story, we can start it, and I can start it anywhere I want, but I chose to start this really in the 11th century. The 11th century was one of those landmark centuries because that was the era, of course, of the Crusades. And when the Western Europe and Western Christianity was coming out of the Dark Ages. Now, the Crusades, we're not going to discuss them, but the net result was a lot of contact with what we now call the Middle East, the countries along the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and ultimately and eventually all the way to the Far East, to China, and to those countries that interspersed between them, northern India and other places along what's called the Great Silk Road. Now, what did this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, what happened is not only did a lot of trade come out of this, a lot of wealth came out of this, a lot of changes in European politics came out and in geopolitical situation. Of course, one of the things that happened, obviously, was there was a great outpouring of devotion for the church. This was exemplified, especially in the first three Crusades, of the popular appeal that it had among people, among the average person, many of which who volunteered, obviously, to go, and then among the nobility of Western Europe. You get away from the concept of individual sovereign nations like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Europe at that time, at the time of the Crusades, and pretty much through this era, we see in the aftermath or in the end of the Dark Ages, it was really chopped up into plots of land ruled by lesser or greater nobility. They were not, the idea of Frenchness or Englishness or Germanness, concept they didn't have. They were Saxons, or they were Scots, or they were inhabitants of Burgundy, Burgundians, or Aquitanians. There was not even a common language even in those countries. one of the things that we find that's important here is the importance of the church later on, especially with the translations of biblical text into the language of the vernacular, is the codification of language. In English history, two of the great landmarks are the Book of Common Prayer, 1549, and then later on, the King James Version did much to standardize English for everybody. You could be living in the same area on the continent and not understand the guy living next door to you almost, because this idea of a common language, there were similarities in regional dialects and all that, but the codification of language had a lot to do, which is why Latin was pretty much the official language of most countries, and especially of the church, obviously. The other thing that came back from the Crusades and had great effect on it was Aristotle. The philosophy, the ethics, the rhetoric, the mathematics, all of this knowledge, which was called the New Learning in the 12th and 13th centuries, came back with the Crusaders, and it's very difficult to get across in just a few sentences the impact this had on Western thought. Pretty much Western thought, and in the church especially, and its theology, was based not only scripturally, but you have to have a way to take, in the early church, you had to be able to argue with your pagan neighbors or your pagan intelligentsia. And of course, you had to speak a common language. And that language was the language of philosophy. And philosophy among the ancients was pretty much wrapped up, in at least for the first 1,000 years, into Plato and the New Platonists. You've heard of the great work by Augustine of Hippo called The City of God and the City of Man. This is an example, probably the best example I know, of this kind of philosophical thought put into a religious context in order to have a common language to discuss matters of doctrine, of what we believe, what we don't believe, what we accept, what we reject, as far as the inner workings of the church, but also as a way to understand cosmology, in other words, the big picture of God and his creation, because we are teleological. I love the word. That's why I like it. I love it. I love the way it comes off the tongue. That means we're going somewhere. In other words, God has a purpose. We're moving from point A to a point distant in time where God will come to rule. And in other words, along that journey, we have to have understanding, and that understanding is filtered through the teachings of the church, not only in ethics, in morality, in all branches of human activity. And Scripture is sufficient and the foundation of that. But when you start applying everyday examples to many things, it's one thing to say love your neighbor. Well, what does that mean? Love's a very big word. Okay? So you have to have a way to get your arms around it, in other words, to understand it. And every era does the same thing. We're no different. Our world, we swim in a certain, as they love to say, milieu. The water we swim in is impacted by the philosophies and the philosophers and theologians of the era we've lived through. In other words, the way we see the world, our focus is filtered through what you and I were taught as children about ethics, about how to conduct oneself, social conventions, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable in those situations, and Christianity itself, as we have seen in recent years, has to sometimes argue with itself over what is the way to do it. We get into many, many disputes, and most of us are aware of the most recent ones. Well, they had the same thing back in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And there was a man came up named St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas was a brilliant guy, a monk. He was a Dominican, I think. But in any case, he was a teacher of ethics and theology. And he wrote a book called Summa Theologica. And the summa means the summary of theology. It's a big book, actually a couple of books, because he addresses different issues about man, about God, about man, and about man's relationship with God. That's about the easiest way I can explain the Summa. That's what it addresses, the nature and character and the being of God, the nature and the character and the being of humanity, and then finally that relationship and how it's structured. Part of this was to bring Roman Catholic. Now, this is the only game in town in the West. There is no other church anywhere. Okay, not even some splinter group, not even Jehovah's Witnesses were there at the time. They're the only ball game in town. So what Aquinas set out to do was to but to filter, to look at Catholic doctrine, what had come down traditionally, and then using Aristotle to filter church doctrine in light of the new learning. We do it all the time. Theologians right now, we're sitting around writing books about how do we do this or do that based on computers and computer age and instant communications. It's nothing new. It's this that Thomas was the first one to try to call what we would call in seminary systematic theology. In other words, a comprehensive theology that covered all the bases. Well, that's virtually an impossible task, and he realized that, which is one reason to read St. Thomas. But in any case, he changed the way the church not only looked at its understanding of God and of Scripture, but itself. When you couple that with the great wealth that was coming into the church from outside and to all of Western Europe, initially filtered through Italy. This is where the Italian Renaissance, all those beautiful paintings and sculptures came from. Well, it first came through this trade that came out of the Near East in the aftermath of the Crusades. And it made Italy very wealthy, and by association, the church started to gain wealth and power. Part of it, too, came from bequests and gifts to the church that were made by the nobility of Europe before, during, and after the Crusades. And also a certain degree of population, of winnowing out of population. In other words, a lot of things were happening in the 13th and 14th century that started to see a great amount of wealth be amassed, and the power and position of the church itself changed. Because through these means, the church started becoming the largest landowner in Europe. Now, land was money. It is estimated that by the time of the Reformation, 250 years after this, the Crusades, that the church owned at least a third of the land in Europe. Land was money. So this process went on and on and on. And with that came great responsibility and also great power. Probably the zenith of it came, and you can debate this point. And if I had somebody here who wanted to debate it, be happy to. But in any case, I think, at least in the English sense, the height of power of the church was when John I was King of England. And he wanted to appoint a guy to be archbishop, and Pope Innocent III disagreed with him and wanted his own candidate. Remember, this is the power of the church permeated every institution in the world, and church and state were virtually synonymous. So the Pope wanted one, John wanted somebody else. John, unfortunately, ran into a pope. His name was German, His name was, he called himself, his papal name was Innocent III. His name was Hildebrand as a cardinal. And he was a man of great intellect, great ambition, and very aggressive. He put England under an interdict. In other words, England, no one could be married, no one could be buried, no one could be baptized, and no one could receive communion. And that lasted almost 7 years, though I'm sure it was violated in a lot of places. But in any case, officially, England was under an interdict, which withheld the sacraments of the church from the people of England until finally John gave in, and they were able to work it out. But that was a case where John, who was not a particularly popular king in England because of other circumstances, ended up being weakened so much that he signed Magna Carta in 1215, a year after the interdict ended. Probably the height of the church's power was the 13th century, and it commanded everyone's loyalty. He was not the only one to be interdicted. There was an area of what is now, the Holy Roman Empire, which was founded by Charlemagne around 900 AD, had come down by this point to be made up pretty much of bits, some bits larger and smaller, of northern Italy, most of Spain that wasn't held by the Moors, by the Islam, most of southern France, virtually all of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and about every whipstitch of Germany was part of this empire. So it was large, and it benefited, of course, through the trade that came out of the Crusades. But it was it was like trying to herd snakes because all of these countries, all of these eventual countries, had their own customs, traditions, ways of being led. Many of them were small states to the point of independent free cities, everything up to large kingdoms like Aragon, Castile in Spain. It was ruled pretty much by the French initially, or the Franks, and then it kind of passed to the Hohenstaufens, which is German or Austrian. And in our era that we're specifically talking about, it had passed into the Austrian Habsburgs under Maximilian I, and then his successor, who ran into Luther. The idea, the church's movement in this area was not anything that it didn't set out to be corrupt. Let me put it that way. That's the easiest way to say it. Nobody set out to be corrupt. But with money, with virtually limitless money, virtually limitless wealth and position and power, it is easy for that to happen. This is the era when you find children being made bishops, not for any other reason than land, that the land wanted to stay there. In other words, the power and the influence of the larger, more powerful nobility got involved in it and set out to dominate and rule and not lose anything, okay? Celibacy of priests start in this period, around 1000 AD, actually a little bit later. In prior years, the papacy had been pretty much left or selected from monastics, starting with Gregory the Great in the 6th century AD. And that had been kind of the rule. You know, I'm giving you broad generalities here because I'm not going to list every pope down for 1,000 years. But generally speaking, the papacy was in Rome. It didn't exercise except moral influence, obviously, because it was involved in still missionary work. It was Gregory in the 6th and 7th century that sent Augustine of Canterbury to England. They still hadn't Christianized in that period northern Europe of Sweden, Denmark, and Sweden and Finland had not been Christianized. But that was kind of the rule. By this time, starting in this period, you start seeing greater and greater influence from the nobility. In other words, there's money, there's land, there's power, and this is where people are gravitating, people who have essentially a dog in the fight, to put it that way. A lot of people have characterized this era of what's called the Middle Ages, or the High Middle Ages, some call it, the period from about the 1200 down to about 1500, as a really rough, difficult time. As one characterized it, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Yeah, you can make a case for that. But it was actually, for most of this period, up to the 14th century, it was not an unhappy time. The church was relatively benevolent. It gave lots of festivals and holidays. One of the principal things that you enjoyed was the days off from work you got from your usual grind. Certainly class distinctions were very, very, very distinct and very deep. But at the same time, they didn't walk around saying, "Oh God, how horrible, we live in the Middle Ages, aren't we terrible? And this is a terrible time." No, they're just like us. They looked around at the world and they tried to enjoy what they could. And it was, as I said, the past is another country, and it's hard sometimes to understand or get into that era in our own minds. But humanity is humanity. They loved, they laughed, they danced, they sang, they had their own times, and unfortunately, it at times became a pretty ugly place to be, especially if you were between nobles who were continually at war with each other one way or the other. Remember, this era started what's called the 100 Years' War, where the English were fighting over the lands in France, in Normandy, in Aquitaine, and it lasted from the beginning of the 14th century in almost to the 15th, near the end of the 15th, before that was over. And then England, no sooner was that over than in England they ended up in the War of the Roses from about 1455 to 1485. With the dynastic war between the House of Lancaster and York. On the continent, there was always something going on, some movement and pull for power or position, especially in Italy, where a lot of stuff started during the Renaissance with the growth of the Italian city-states, Milan and Venice and all of these other cities walled themselves up. A lot of the terminology of fortifications, incidentally, on a little aside, militarily, came from the Italian. Most of the words that we used when I worked at Fort Pulaski for the fort itself were Italian in origin, whereas the guys coming to get them, when the Federals got over on Tybee, most of those words came from the French, from a man named Vauban, who was a great French engineer, laid siege. But so Italy became a focal point and a place where great wealth was amassed, and here we go again. Great wealth produced wonderful works of art, it produced great statues, it also produced the Borgias and the Medicis, who were very powerful families. And eventually they will, as we'll find out shortly, work their way into the church and into the papacy. Probably the other good thing that happened in this period was the rise of the great universities. Most of the great, that we think of Sorbonne, the University of Paris, University of Prague, Oxford, all of these came out of this 13th, 14th century era where learning became important, but the thing they were mostly going to school for was to be lawyers. And I don't mean to sue somebody for tripping over your cat, okay? We're talking canon law. The church itself had become so involved in everyday matters and in the adjudication of disputes and you name it, that the great need arose by this time by the beginning of the 14th century for a lot more people to understand, interpret, and utilize canon law. So if you want to thank somebody for lawyers, you can thank the Roman Catholic Church, who needed a lot of them at that time. There wasn't that much need before, but by this time, canon law, mainly because what? They were involved in what, mainly? Land disputes, beneficences, gifts, bequests, you name it. When we put all of this together, we find by the beginning of the 14th century this great era of church growth in power and wealth and influence have resulted in a church that was becoming increasingly off base. The word corrupt is a bad word. There were corrupt, hey, there's corrupt people in the church right now, even as we speak. I hate to tell you all that. I know this will be surprised. I know you'll be shocked. Okay, I saw Casablanca. Okay, I'm shocked. Gambling's going on here. But in any case, as the church moved into this, through this era of redefining itself, of looking at its doctrine, you started getting somewhat of a, because you now had people to dispute it, it was no longer handed down in tradition. It was becoming more consolidated, more dense, and a lot stronger, and influenced a great deal. Had a great deal of influence on everybody's life, right down to the lowest peasant, who really in many ways did not understand what was going on, obviously. There was not a great deal of literacy. The Mass was done in Latin, which very few people knew outside of the church. Very few people were educated beyond much. For most nobility, their greatest education came in their training as a swordsman or as a warrior, which was absolutely necessary. The fine arts were not part of that regimen. Then along comes, at the end, along comes probably the 14th century, as Tushman said, is one of those watershed centuries. One of the reasons was this was the time when the Black Death came into Western Europe. No, it was not good. The Black Death started from those same trade routes out of the Eastern Mediterranean, probably landed at Venice or one of the seaport towns, and began to spread along those same trade routes into the Germanies, into northern Italy, and into the Germanies. And it is estimated, we don't have any idea how many, but the best guess, the range that most historians give it, is anywhere from 30 to 50% of the population of Europe died during the 14th century, mainly from the Black Death. Now, it didn't all come between 1320 and 1325. It moved, boom, 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 all around. England, being where it was, didn't get the Black Death, until a little later than the ones on the continent, obviously. But it came, and it came with a vengeance. They tried everything they knew. If anything undermined the people's confidence in the church, it was the Black Death. It's hard to describe. You would go to a town and nobody'd be sick. You go to a monastery 5 miles from the town and not a monk would be alive. It was random, it seemed to them. It had no pattern. It had almost a will of its own. And of course, now we know that it was spread by fleas who got onto rats, and rats were everywhere. This is what the Pied Piper of Hamelin, for all you children's story people, the Pied Piper of Hamelin comes out of that. There were people who were rat catchers. They realized a relationship. They didn't know it was the flea that carried the bacillus, but they knew that wherever there were rats, they usually would have an outbreak. So rats became things to get rid of, which obviously they couldn't, and we can't either in any case. But the Black Death had an effect on Europe that was just mind-boggling to us today. No matter what anybody tried, they couldn't do it. Prayer, incense, works of mercy, you name it. They couldn't do anything to stop it. It had to literally burn itself out, which is what eventually happened. Or some people believe, some epidemiologists believe, that it mutated, that the virus or the bacteria that caused it did some kind of a mutation in that period and became something else that may have been benign. But in any case, for whatever reason. But this lasted probably throughout most of the middle part of the 14th century. And when you couple that with the ongoing war with England and the French interest in the East, in the eastern part, the western part of France, it became highly, highly problematic for people's faith. This is when you start seeing flagellant orders. They're lampooned now anymore. And if you don't, go watch Monty Python if you're in the Holy Grail. And I see some smiles out there. You know what I'm talking about. But you have these people who would literally subject themselves to extreme punishment in order, because people would connect, well, obviously we've sinned and God's wrath is upon us. And really a culture of death came out of this. And the imagery from that period for us is somewhat ghastly if you ever get into it. This was the impact. At the end of this benighted century, you have the spectacle of a schism in the West over the papacy. In other words, it's called the Great Schism. It started in 1378 and didn't end until 1418, when there were, for a while, two popes. One at Avignon under the French royalty and another one at Rome, who mutually anathematized each other. It was disagreements over papal succession with the different factions out of mainly the Holy Roman Empire, who controlled pretty much who became pope. And they chose one candidate in 1389, and the other one chose another. And the French being kind of in the driver's seat, the election of Benedict served to separate Western Christianity. So now you have a church that has no really defined leader, and pretty much propped up by one or the other side of the electors and the nobility of the Holy Roman Empire. England was not a player. Remember, England had its own troubles in this early period. They were still fighting with the French. The Great Schism did a lot to undermine people's faith in the institution of the church, in other words. So you start seeing in this late 14th century the first beginnings of people who were started to criticize the church for what it was doing or not doing. Now, there had been reform movements in the church before. There had been voices in the earlier periods, and mainly were expressed through founding new orders of monastic orders. We always get confused, and I do too. There were Benedictines and Franciscans and Dominicans and all of these different orders, each one of which was generally put out and approved as some form of a reform movement. And that's been pretty much the job of virtually every church reform movement from now, since before time, till today. I hate to tell you that, but it is the truth. Everyone, in other words, who's a reformer pictures themselves as returning the church to its roots, to the foundation of Christianity, to the quote-unquote pure church. Now, whether you can do that or not, I don't think so. because we are fallible human beings. I'm kind of an Augustinian in that respect, that I do believe in original sin, and that we are flawed human beings, therefore human institutions are flawed. Not irredeemably flawed, but flawed nonetheless. So the first man I want to draw your attention to is a man you may not have ever heard of, John Wycliffe. W-Y-C-L-I-F-F-E. Wycliffe was a theologian at Oxford. In 1380, he translated the Old Testament into Middle English, out of Latin into Middle English. It was the first complete translation of the Scripture into English. He also wrote a lot, okay? He was a theologian. Most of these people were, I'm going to mention from now on, including Luther himself, were theologians or scholars. Most of them were priests. This is how you got an education. And many ways, they led kind of an ivory tower existence, like a lot of academics. They ended up kind of being, at least talking to people that were like them. They didn't go around talking to the peasants. This is where Luther is the exception, I think, in many cases. Most of these guys corresponded with each other one way or the other. Wycliffe, including his translation, also wrote a lot about the church. And if I were to name some of the things that he wrote about priestly celibacy. He wrote about making offerings to images. He wrote about prayers, making prayers for the dead. He talked about abortion, child murder, and warfare is contrary to the New Testament. So most of these are very familiar, because most of these ended up on Luther's 95 Theses as well. There is a connection with Wycliffe to a man on the continent named Jan Hus, H-U-S or H-U-S-S. Hus was a little bit slightly younger. He was born in 1370, died in 1415, tragically. But in 1402, Hus led a reform movement based on the writings of Wycliffe in Czechoslovakia today. It would be, the country then was Bohemia, and they were called the Hussites. They were one of the first openly, on the continent at least, there was a group in England who followed Wycliffe called the Lollards. And the Lollards were mainly a grassroots movement. When Wycliffe started making his critique of the church, he stressed the importance of preaching, which he did a lot of. And a lot of people heard him. Now remember, we're in an era where there is no form of mass communication. There is no internet. I know some of our younger people would be shocked to know that there was a time before the internet or the cell phone. But in any case, the Lollard movement is contemporaneous with Huss. Huss on the continent and the Lollards in England. The followers of Wycliffe were pretty much vexed, not only over the critique of Wycliffe of the church, but also of the schism. The Great Schism had a great effect on them. Wycliffe himself was charged with heresy in 1378, but the movement continued on. He was never brought to trial. He continued to write and preach until his death in 1384. So he died before most of these events came to fruition. But the movement, it was suppressed. It was an absolute outward Lollard rising in 1414 that was put down. Henry V quickly defeated by King Henry V. Remember him? That's the guy at Agincourt. Band of Brothers in Shakespeare's Henry V. Same guy. He ferociously put down the Lollard movement, which was mainly in northern England. They actually tried to march on London and were met by the king and were defeated very roundly by him. They really didn't care back then how many peasants you killed, especially if they were guilty of treason. Remember that to go against the church was to commit treason. The church did not execute anybody. The secular authority. People were burned at the stake by the church. Nope. Burned at the stake by the secular authority, who, when the church turned them over, was therefore guilty of treason. Now, the church could question them, and did. The church would get the confession out of them, and then they'd turn them over to secular authority to carry out the determination of the king or the ruler. The church didn't burn anybody, despite what a lot of Protestants wrote later on. Through the offices of the church, they were condemned. But directly, probably somewhere. But again, by Aristotle, you're going to love this, they were actually doing them a favor. Sure. What was important? What's more important? Your corporal body or your immortal soul? So, by purification, if someone recanted even at the stake and they had still sinned, they had still committed grievous sin, so you were purifying them and making them potentially righteous before God. Interesting, isn't it, how that works? And therefore, if you went unrecanted, if you didn't recant, you didn't, you said, no, this is all a lie and you're condemning me, well, you needed to be gotten rid of anyway, because you were obviously an agent of Satan. The logic works, okay, to the schoolmen, to the scholastics. And this is the philosophical water that everybody swam through and lived in. Both Huss and Wycliffe were condemned for heresy. Wycliffe, after his death, his bones were dug up and burned. Huss himself wasn't that lucky. In 1415, he was burned at the stake. And they saved his soul. It was the council, and at the same year that they were condemned, the Council of Constance met, and this is who condemned them. They finally were able to smooth over the Great Schism, and it ended in 1418. Another great blow that came to Christianity a few years later was, of course, the sacking or the taking of Constantinople by Islam, 1453. The Christian kingdom of Constantinople fell to the Muslims, and Europe itself was threatened. As a matter of fact, in Austria today, there is probably the greatest display of medieval arms and armor in Vienna. And this was amassed by the Holy Roman Emperor because the Turks, Islam, had threatened and were advancing on Vienna. And the king ordered that arms and equipment be amassed for use to the armies. And the Turks actually got to the gates of Vienna before they had to withdraw. But it's used today to almost, and when they tell you that some piece of arms or armor, what date it is, that's the landmark, is this armory that's still in existence and still has the same stuff they amassed in the 15th century. So It's kind of a landmark. In 1493, a Holy Roman Emperor named Maximilian came to lead that empire. Maximilian was the first of what we call the Habsburgs, who lasted all the way down in Austria and Austro-Hungary to World War I. The Austrian, there were also the Spanish Habsburg, another branch went to Spain, and that's the one that contended with the New World and all the Spanish treasure and Queen Elizabeth. But so the domination of the empire kind of switched between Austria from really Czechoslovakia to Austria and then eventually to Spain. So we enter the era right before the Reformation. Are you with me so far? It's a lot of information, and I have run through this thing so fast that my professor of church history would be throwing stuff at me right now. But no, I want you to get a feel for the times that we're going to be investigating theologically. It was not a time of tumult, in other words. Actually, the dust was kind of settling, except in England. And even in England in 1485 was when Henry VII, eventually Henry Tudor, defeated Richard III at Bosworth, and the Tudor family came to the throne of England. So even England was settling down by that time. And the Tudors came to the throne under Henry VII, and of course he was followed by Henry VIII. Yeah. We're getting on a little more familiar ground now? Okay. And on the continent, the greatest thing that happened, at least as far as we're concerned with, and the greatest instrument that was created in 1455 was the press, the printing press by Gutenberg. Absolute landmark. Because if you think about it, why did Wycliffe and Hus fail? Why did the Lollard movement fail? Anybody care to put out a thought? Mm-hmm. Right. No dissemination of the ideas. Those ideas bounce from university to university, from monastery to monastery, from seminary to seminary, but never really got out. In other words, they couldn't organize. The Lollard movement was a serious movement, and it was one that had to be defeated militarily. But at the same time, all of England didn't rise up. There were certain nobles that rose up, and part of that was out of the insecurity of England. Remember, we're coming into, in the middle of the 14th, 15th century, the War of the Roses. So there was a lot of instability in England, and a lot of the reasons why certain nobles got involved with the Lollard movement was they might gain a little bit by it. You know, if these guys took over, we might be on the winning side and get more land or more property. I'm not saying they weren't devout. Certainly they were and into their faith. But there were other motivations than simply those of making a purer church, for some at least. By the 16th century, of course, Maximilian was getting old. He died in 1503. The Roman Church had been taken over about the middle of the century by the factions within northern Italy, by first the Medici family and then the Borgia family. And this is where a lot of the story, remember the tale of Luther going to Rome? Some of you were familiar. He made a journey to Rome before he wrote this and was very disappointed at what he saw in Rome. A lot of corruption, a lot of degeneracy. I think it's kind of like if you're a young guy and you've never been, how you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris kind of thing. But in any case, he had built up in his mind, I think, as a scholar and somewhat of an ivory tower guy, that he was going to see the glory of God when he got to Rome. What he got to see was the corrupt underbelly of an Italian city-state that was not very pretty by that time, with monuments falling down and the old Roman ruins that were still there. It wasn't very clean, it wasn't very pretty, and the church that he found did not meet his expectations. Okay? The papacy was under the Medicis, and we end up in 1506 when Pope Julius, you ever heard of Julius? What did he do? Seen the Sistine Chapel? He is the one that, in the agony and the ecstasy, he was the guy that commissioned Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel. But he was also a pope that put on armor and went out and led his troops against first Maximilian and then later Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in the fighting in northern Italy. The church became, and I'm going to sum this up, so I want to give about 5 or 10 minutes of any questions or anything that you would like me to elucidate. I've tried to cover a very broad area, and I hope that you've got some idea of what we will be discussing now in more theological terms, in other words. That this was an era ripe for reform. Virtually everybody except those whose ox was going to be gored by Reformation was in favor of it. The church had pushed everybody to the limit because as the popes became more venal in their outlook, they demanded more out of their people. And as they tried to rebuild the eternal city, they needed more and more and more money. And that became a goal, because remember, these people were not only, they were rivals, in other words. There was a rivalry between city-states and between families. And they forgot who their flock was. Their flock became sheep to be shorn in many respects by these popes, not the church as a whole. Now don't get that in your mind. Most people went along with it because that was the way they were taught and that's the way they were educated. And to destabilize the church meant destabilizing society as a whole. The church is what bound everybody together. It was the cement that kept the wall up. So when you went against the church, you were not just expressing an opinion. We're so used to that way of thinking that we can express our opinion. Well, your opinion might get you tied to a stake and be invited to a barbecue where you were the chief guest. Because you were threatening not just your soul or whatever, you were threatening everybody else's. So to do what these other reformers did, and they put their lives on the line. This is the era when people became unafraid to put their life on the line. If you want to summarize the era right prior to the Reformation, people became unafraid. They became so convinced of their view, of the biblical view of the church and how it should be, how it was instituted, that they became no longer afraid to put their life on the line in order to reform it. And I think that's kind of a watershed thing. So I've got about, 5 minutes or 10? Okay. But I do want to ask if there are any questions or any points you'd like me to elucidate. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just briefly, because we'll get to that. And matter of fact, my session tomorrow will be, I will address the Holy Communion and baptism in a more particular way. So I don't want to, I don't want to ruin my, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot. I usually shoot myself in the head. The change came. Let me give it very quickly. In the earliest part of the church, the first writings we have about the nature of the Eucharist come from Justin Martyr. Now we're talking 3rd century AD. And he expresses it pretty much in the words of what our Lord said at the Last Supper. This is my body, this is my blood. Okay? The church, as I have been unable to find out, everything seems to, nothing exists before Thomas Aquinas, okay? The church did not have, as I have, my research has shown, a firm doctrine of the nature of the Holy Communion. They pretty much took it out of the biblical text, which really, to be very frank about it, confirms Luther. The real presence. I don't think that Justin Martyr, this is my own opinion, I don't think that Justin Martyr, in a time when Christianity was suspect of being engaged in cannibalism, would have talked about we're drinking real blood and eating real flesh. Let me put it that way. I think his health would have been greatly impaired if he had, because the Romans were very sensitive about that idea of cannibalism. That had been outlawed by Augustus back in the 1st century. I mean, big deal. But until Thomas, until the 13th century, you don't have a real firm idea of the nature, what we're talking about in the Eucharistic presence. How is Christ present in it? What Thomas did was take it through the Aristotelian thought process of appearances, accidents, and substance. In other words, what you saw looked like bread and wine, but it became the body and the blood of our Lord. That was its true substance and or essence. What you were seeing was the accident. And it's all wrapped up in Aristotelian metaphysical philosophy. I know it sounds nuts, but that's the way they interpreted it. When the Romans, and I know recently they've sat down about this, and transubstantiation is a word that you don't find much before Thomas. So the real presence is kind of what the Romans and the Lutherans in recent years have kind of come a little closer together on. Now, the real split, we'll find out later, comes between Ulrich Zwingli, and Martin Luther. And if you want to know where Protestantism defined, you really have 3 categories. The Romans still hold to that doctrine of transubstantiation. Anglicans, Lutherans, Orthodox hang on to the idea of real presence, and others hold on to the idea of memorial. But I'm getting into something tomorrow. We will go into somewhat more detail, and I'll explain Aristotle for beginners.
You'll hear some more about William Tyndall. He's very interesting. He factors into this very significantly.
The Lollards were, one way of controlling the Lollards, by the way, was to dig up their inspiration, which was Tyndall, and burn him. So, crazy thinking, but there you go.
Yeah, well, Tyndall is a little later. He's in the Lutheran. I didn't want to get into Luther past 15th century.
Yeah, thank you.